Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Amateur Hour Sports Podcast. My name is Jacob Gramenya, and in this episode, it is part 2 of my interview with NHL writer and published author Mike Commito. And in this episode, Mike gives his opinions on the current state of the LA Kings, what the future holds for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and his opinions on the Sudbury Wolves. As I mentioned, this is part 2. Part 1 came out yesterday where Mike talked about his writing work, how he almost missed out on his chance to interview the great one, Wayne Gretzky, and his processes of getting his book published about the history of hockey. If you want to go check that out, you can go through the Twitter and Instagram of the podcast, which is at AmateurPDC, Twitter and Instagram. You can go through YouTube at Amateur Sports or Amateur Sports on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. All of the links for the Amateur Hour Sports Podcast, as well as all of Mike Commito's links, will be in the description. But in the meantime, enjoy the episode. Let's switch over to the hockey work. Let's start with the Kings. I'm going to start a bit about the writing, then go into kind of your opinion on the affairs with the LA Kings right now. How did you get started with the LA Kings?
Yeah, so there's, I guess it's a bit of a backstory there. So like I had wrote for the Royal Half, like an LA Kings fan blog for a good full season. This was probably back in 2015, 2016. So I did that for them, and then in the summer of 2018, one of the Jesse Cohen, who hosts the All the Kings Men podcasts and kind of coordinates the LA Kings radio network they have now, he reached out to me because he wanted to start doing like a weekly Kings history segment. And so we did our first one for the 30th anniversary of when Gretzky was traded to the Kings in August of 88. So we started doing those every week or every second week. But I remember on that first episode or segment that we did, he asked me, how did you get into all this, like into hockey history writing? And so I kind of mentioned a story where, after I had graduated from Mac and I was starting to get more and more serious about hockey writing, I reached out to all the clubs in the NHL to see if they have a historian on staff, or are they looking to potentially add some historical capacity and all these things. And I actually heard back from a lot of those teams in some way, shape, or form. And then I guess after saying that on the episode, I reiterated it on Twitter, and the Kings, sent me, they just replied to one of my tweets and said, we never got a message from you. And so I was like, okay. So I slid into their DMs and I didn't go to the DMs yet. I said, name the time and the place and let's have a chat. And then they DM'd me and said well, let's set up a call. And so I ended up talking to Mikel or Michael on the phone and got that all set up. And then that's kind of how it all happened. We just started to kind of hash out what did he envision me doing, and it was very much aligned with the hockey history writing that I was doing right now, or at the time. And then we just kind of kept it I think I wrote my first story that October. And, now at the time of you and I talking, I think I've done over almost 35 stories now over the course of this season and a half. So it was literally again, I would have, Twitter, I credit Twitter with the assist on that for sure, because that's how they saw it. But certainly it all kind of ties back to the fact that I knew Jesse from the Royal Half days and kind of had a little familiarity with some of the people who wrote and worked for the Kings at the time and still do now. And so I think all that kind of just was led up to that moment, and the timing worked out really well.
So odd that a Leafs fan became an LA Kings writer.
Yeah.
Through Twitter. I'm going to switch over to kind of your opinions of the LA Kings at the moment. How do you feel about the project the LA Kings have on their hands at the moment?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a transitionary time right now. I mean, I think I'm optimistic about the future for the club. They have one of the deepest prospect pools in the league. And so I think looking ahead, when you start to think about players like Turcotte and Arthur Kaliev and Tobias Bjornfot and all those guys coming in, I think that the Kings fans have a lot of reasons to be optimistic. It's obviously hard to see your team, have the seasons that they're having and being in the basement. I mean, but then again, there's always, as much as tanking, or not tanking, but as much as losing is not fun to watch, and especially not fun to be a part of if you're on that team. Hopefully there's a silver lining at the end of the season where, maybe those ping pong balls will align. They'll get another high pick. There's obviously some deep talent in the draft pool coming up this year, and so that'll only add to their already pretty deep prospect pool. So I think, it's funny because obviously as much as it sucks to kind of see the team in in its current iteration where it's like at the bottom of the league. I mean, as somebody who's writing about hockey history, there are times when like that is beneficial, where you can kind of pivot away from some of the stuff that's happening by looking back at a moment in the past. And I mean, you have to be careful about that too, because the fans don't care about what happened 30 years ago, but sometimes depending on how it's kind of brought up, it is a nice distraction from what's happening, is that we can still remember these times. And I mean, it's also a lot easier to be a Kings fan in this moment because they won Stanley Cups in 2012 and 2014, right? We're not talking, as Leafs fans, where, when the Leafs are going through their rebuild, a few years ago, like you could go back to 1967, right? So that's not comforting to somebody who hadn't been born yet, but at least there's a generation of Kings fans who know like how successful the team was, and that kind of gives you at least like some context to say, like, I've seen them win at the ultimate level. So maybe this next generation that's coming through the ranks, being guided by the core group that's still there, will kind of lead to that next era of success on the ice.
What do you think their plan is going to be as the trade deadline approaches?
I think there's a couple pieces that they have, in their back pocket. I don't really get the inside information like from an operational level, but I mean, I think there's been rumors even with the Leafs, as we're kind of linking the two back together, like there's always talk that do the Leafs need more grit or sandpaper, right? And like Kyle Clifford's a name where he has some familiarity with Dubas from their Greyhounds days. He's that could be a fit. I mean, Alec Martinez on defense has another year on his deal, but that's seeming to be more of an attractive piece for teams now, is getting that free agent that's not just a pure rental, but you have another year to kind of make a more of a longer run. We saw that last,
and he's on good money, Alec Martinez. $4 million a year, I believe.
Yeah, and so you saw last year when the Leafs traded for Muzzin, so they got that half season and then this season out of him before you got to talk free agency, and then even the year before that with Ryan McDonough when the Lightning acquired him, like that wasn't a pure rental. He had another year, right? So I think that there's some potential moves to be made for sure. It'll just be interesting to see what they do, but I would imagine they're going to be sellers for sure, because they're way well out of it at this point.
I think with the core that they've had, I think they're still kind of a little bit hanging on to the Stanley Cup guys they had, like the Carters, the Toffolis, which I think now they might feel like they need to move on from. I think they're just starting to realize that now. Is there going to be a short-term or a long-term rebuild, in your opinion?
Well, it's always tough to say, right? Because I think that sometimes you think you're in one position in your rebuild and something happens that really accelerates it. I mean, it could be dependent on if they win the lottery, right? Let's say they win the lottery and all of a sudden you have a game-changing player that you can bring in into your system in addition to your other prospects that you're slowly kind of bringing up. So it's tough to say because ultimately, and I think it kind of goes back to your point as to who do they keep around. I mean, the other name that we didn't throw out there in terms of a deadline player is like Toffoli, as you'd mentioned. Like he's a player who is obviously teams are looking for support on the wing. He kind of would fit nicely into that that second or third unit.
I agree.
And like you look, and I think even Elliot Friedman had talked about how the Bruins apparently have a deal in their back pocket, whatever that means. But there's other teams like the Oilers and the Flames and the Avs who need help shoring up offense as well. So I think he'd be obviously an attractive piece. But to your point on the rebuild timelines, I think it's I don't think they're in any rush to bring these guys up if they're not ready to play yet at the NHL level. I don't think they're going to do that. I think they've been pretty open about the process they're going through. So I don't think it's a secret that they're in a bit of a rebuild. So if it takes a little bit of time, I think the fans will hopefully be patient with that, because ultimately, to the previous point, they've seen what success looks like. And so if you've seen that recently, I think it's a little bit easier to make that case to your fan base that we're doing this, it's going to take a little bit more time, versus if you're a fan base who's never won or hasn't won for a long time, like how do you then, plead year after year that like we're working on it, right? So I think they'll have a longer leash, but ultimately
sure.
I think they're going to start the next year. Hopefully there's improvement.
And you were talking about the potential in the draft lottery, and you are, like I said, a team historian for the Sudbury Wolves. How excited are you about the potential of Quinton Byfield putting on an LA Kings jersey come draft night?
That was like, I remember like when that kind of like, I had that thought before the season started that like I hadn't even considered that last year, but it would be the perfect like confluence for me if Byfield was drafted by the Kings, just as somebody who like works for both clubs. So we'll see what happens. Ultimately, now with the new lottery system, the Kings will have to win at least 2 lotteries, to get to that second pick. Or, I mean, ideally, if they get the first overall pick, they're not picking Byfield number 1, but they'll. But if they had the number 2 or 3 pick, like that's likely where he's going to go. And that would be really cool to see that happen as somebody who can, who's who's had the opportunity to watch him play in Sudbury, and then ultimately to kind of see him transition to pro with the Kings is something I'm definitely rooting for. But ultimately, I'm just hoping that whatever pick they get a player that can kind of add to what they're already building.
What do you think is Quinton Byfield's potential in the NHL?
Well, I mean, he's definitely fits the new mold of the game now. Like speed first in the NHL, that's definitely one of his hallmarks. As for somebody who's as big as he is, he certainly doesn't move like somebody who's 6'4", like 220 pounds. And I mean, he's only 17 years old still, so like he'll turn 18 in the summertime. So he only has the potential to get bigger and faster, stronger. So I think that he has the potential to definitely turn some heads in the NHL. I know that it's been a treat to watch him this year. I mean, there's been a few. I try to follow all of his goals and kind of curate them in a thread as well. And I mean,
I'm on that thread too.
Yeah, there's been a few where like literally he's not even in the frame, and then he comes into the frame and scores, and it's like that's insane. And I know that obviously it'll be a different transition from junior to pro.
Yeah.
But I think that people who've been watching him closely at the OHL level know how special of a player he is, and that if he can translate those skills to the NHL, he'll be even just as fun to watch there too.
Let's switch over to Maple Leafs talk, because I, like you, am a Maple Leafs fan, and we've been struggling. I haven't dealt with this struggle nearly as long as you have, because I'm much younger. But what is the ceiling for the current roster? I guess we'll start with this season that they have.
Like as it currently assembled?
Yeah, the ceiling with the roster right now. How high can they get this season?
Yeah, to be honest, it's one of those things where like I thought, and I mean I knew going into it that like the defense is not sorted out. Like that's still an ongoing issue. So as much as you look at their forwards and think that this is arguably like one of the deepest, if not deepest, like offensive pools in the NHL, the defense has its issues and it hasn't really been shored up yet. And now all of a sudden we're seeing like Frederik Andersen is struggling. Is he being overworked? You know, you could make that case. He's played a lot of games the last few seasons, right? And so do I think they're a Stanley Cup contender in the current formation? No. But then again, like anything can happen in the playoffs, right? But we're now at a point in the season where, you know, that's not even a guarantee that they'll get in, right?
Yeah.
Like I think they will ultimately, because I don't think that Dubas is just going to kind of let this year slip by without making some kind of move to try to address some of these issues. But I think they're pretty close to being like a legitimate Stanley Cup contender, but I don't think they're there right now, like as at the time of us talking in January 2020.
What do you think the window for the success is then? How long can they sustain being like just there or a Stanley Cup contender?
I mean, I think they have a pretty big window. I mean, ultimately, like a lot of the guys they have locked up long term aren't, you know, they're not even in their prime yet if you look at statistically what that looks like. So, but I mean, in terms of like the group that they have locked up, I remember when they finally made the last of the signings going into the year, like they have at least 3 years of like I think 6 of the top 9 forwards are together, right? So you've got that 3-year window where you have all of them there. But I mean, even after that window, guys are going to move on. Like you're going to have to get rid of some of those middle 6 guys because that's what happens when you're trying to build towards a championship. And so I think the window is much longer than that current thing. I don't think it's like they have to win in 3 years, otherwise they're going to be in trouble. I think especially as you know, the league, as hopefully the cap continues to rise, that'll just give them more flexibility. But I think it's an optimistic time to be a Leafs fan, but ultimately I've been burned far too many times before that. It's tough to kind of go through the motions, but I think now, you know, as you'd mentioned, where I think Leafs fans a few years ago thought that maybe we'd still be in a rebuild mode, you know, maybe at this point when Babcock was hired and he talked about, you know, there's going to be years of pain coming up and things kind of accelerated, and now we're at the point where there's expectations, right?
Yeah.
And you saw the coach already got fired, and you know there's all sorts of other issues that went along with that. But I think now the pressure is starting to mount, right? And you start to wonder at what point does the leashes become a little bit shorter for other, you know, executives on the club if things are not addressed and the club doesn't improve.
Do you think you will ever witness a Maple Leafs Stanley Cup victory?
Well, I feel like I can't, like any answer I say is going to be terrible, right? Because I either say no and then I'm just like a joyless hockey life, or yes and never comes true and I jinx the team.
You can be honest.
Honestly, it's I'm trying to think of like I remember I watched the Jays win a World Series, and like so that's really the only thing I've ever I think had a personal connection to as a fan. But again, I was only
Raptors. I don't know how big of a.
Oh yeah, but I mean, I wasn't like I'm not a huge basketball fan,
okay.
so I mean, I would say like I was always a big baseball fan growing up. We watched a lot of Blue Jays games, but again, when they won, you know, back-to-back World Series, I was 7 and 8 years old. So it's not as if I was like an invested fan, so to speak. Didn't really know who's on the roster. I could name you all their starting lineup at the time, but I would say, you know, the Raptors is giving me hope. Although I don't think they've had as tough a road as a Leafs fan, so to speak. But I think that it's optimistic. I would say yes within my lifetime. That would be great.
I agree. I think within the lifetime. You can give a quick answer for this, but my next question: what about next 5 years? Will they win a Stanley Cup?
Will they win a Stanley Cup in the next 5 years? Well, we'll go on record and say yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, let's just do that. But it's funny you say that though, because I remember my buddy Jord, his dad is a diehard Blackhawks fan. And so at the time
there was a big gap.
Big gap, and he was like, I remember we were all invested because we were in a hockey pool, right? So none of us were Blackhawks or Flyers fans. We were watching the game at his house the night that Patrick Kane scored the game-winning goal, and I just remember looking over at him and like seeing like how happy he was, and like even at his age, and he wasn't old, but he was like in his 50s. He hadn't seen a Stanley Cup, or maybe he might have been like a couple years old, but I don't think he had at that point, and so. It kind of was like, I hope that I'll be in a position to see that for a team that I cheer for.
Yeah, and for me, I went 19 years of my life without seeing any sort of success in Toronto until the Raptors finally won, and that's 19 years.
Yeah.
And really, you kind of start becoming a hardcore sports fan at about, I'd say 8, maybe 10. So not nearly as long of a struggle as a lot of these other people, like you said there, but it hurts to go through even that long of a period.
Yeah.
And I can understand the hurt from like a big Leafs fan like yourself, what you're going through. Well, last topic we'll touch on, we'll switch over to the Sudbury Wolves. You are the team historian for the Sudbury Wolves. You live in Sudbury. What does this role entail as a team historian? What do you do for this role?
Yeah, so I think a role like for the Wolves or for any team as a historian is, my primary goal is, I think, to really kind of help the team like celebrate its history, right? And so there's many ways that you can do that. We saw last year they retired Rod Schutt's number, which was very long overdue for all that he did for the club. He had that 72-goal season. So there's outward things you can do like that, but I also think telling those stories that connect different groups of fans together is important, right? So you have the fans now who are watching, Quinton Byfield go through his heyday in Sudbury, and they're going to games maybe with their parents or their grandparents who had watched Mike Foligno play. And so my goal as a historian is to try to tell the stories that will resonate with today's fans who are going to the games with their family, and try to tell stories that kind of link together both those groups who remember what it was like when the Wolves were kind of at their peak in the 70s, to the group like my age when we were going to the 2007 playoff run, to now the fans that are watching the game now. So I think that's kind of what it's about. And I mean, I think the other unique role at the junior level is because there's so much turnover that a lot of these guys are only with the club for 2 to 3 years, some of them even less than that, right? A lot of them go on their separate ways, right? And they don't all go off to play pro hockey. Some of them will go play CIS hockey, or some of them will go and they'll find a job doing something else entirely, right? And I think it's still important to share those stories because they all go off and contribute to society in different ways, right? So I mean, it's easy to tell the stories about the guys that went off and had a successful hockey career, but I also think it's important to kind of, as the historian, engage with the alumni and talk about their stories, whether or not they go into banking or they become a firefighter. I think it's still important and they still have a lasting impact in the community. And so I think that's, at the end of the day, it's kind of like it's working with the alumni, right? And so I provide the team a resource that I'm able to talk to these folks. They see that the team is obviously interested in preserving and honoring their heritage. And so I think that's a big part of my role as well, is kind of being that outreach piece to say that we're going to do a story on you because we care about what you contributed to the club and we care about what you're doing now. And so I think at the end of the day, if that's what I'm doing, then I'm doing my job. And so we just had a story that came out this week actually on Shandor Alfonso, who played for the Wolves, went on to play for Lakehead Thunderwolves at the OUA level, went into finance, and then got interested in officiating through the NHL's exposure combine for former junior players, and now he's a linesman in the NHL. And so it's kind of cool to see those different trajectories where for him, he might have thought that after playing OUA hockey, like that's it, right? But somehow he finds another path, gets to the NHL, and so it's kind of cool to highlight those different types of stories.
So here's my last question. It's going to be again about the Wolves. Since I think they joined the OHL in 1972.
Yeah.
They do not have a championship yet.
Yeah.
So I guess it's hard for you to be a fan of the Wolves and the Leafs, still waiting for a championship, still waiting for a ring. But after Byfield leaves, do you think that the Sudbury Wolves will be able to overcome the stigma that they are unable to recruit high caliber prospects like Luukkonen, like Byfield?
I think they already have, right? As evidence that the fact that you had, Luukkonen came over and that was huge. Like he's arguably like the most talented and skilled goaltender the club has ever had in its history. I mean, I know that he didn't statistically hit all of those major records, but watching him on the ice, like, he was the reason why the team was so successful last year, right? I mean, if you think of how much Byfield has progressed as a player this year, if you would have had Byfield in his current form right now with Luukkonen, how he played last year, the team,
I was actually thinking about asking you that,
would be scary, right? Because ultimately, like, that's, you could, one of the weaknesses of the team this year is obviously goaltending, right? And so if they had the caliber of goaltender they had last year now, it would be a much scarier team, and you could make the argument for making more of a push to maybe acquire some of those players at the deadline to really know that this is like a perfect storm of, you have like the best player ever in franchise history from a talent level and as a goaltender, and then also Byfield, you could really make that push. But I think that because of that he came here as a first overall pick, and he's been committed to being in Sudbury, and he's doing outreach in the community. He's doing a lot of great work that I think Sudbury is overcoming that stigma that people don't want to come here, right? You're always going to have certain individuals who don't want to come to Sudbury for whatever reason, but I think that more than ever, the club has been able to overcome that. And I think that'll only continue to improve as the years come. But ultimately, winning changes everything. But the club is as close as it's ever been to trying to get that elusive championship. But it'll be a hard thing to accomplish.
And that will end my questions. Thank you for taking the time for this interview. I really like the stories you tell. I think it's very inspiring to somebody like myself, who is trying to build up through the sports media world themselves, and you're showing that it's very possible to do so if you put your mind to it and you work hard, time manage well. But so thank you very much for coming on the show, telling your stories. I'm going to link all of Mike's stuff in the description. You can follow him on Twitter. I love his Twitter. He posts every day about On This Day in Hockey. Nice. I'll link his book. You can get his book on Amazon. Very interesting. Like I said, every day a different story. But that will wrap up this episode of the Amateur Hour Sports Podcast. We post every single day for new stories in sport every day. So join us again. We will see you tomorrow.